Linda, thanks. Ron, Mike Pence. Linda mentioned that Mike Pence's name is often mentioned in terms of possible presidential candidates in 2016. I can assure you that's true because I often mention it in that context. ALEC's been around for 40 years and has been a leader on changing the nation in the right direction. And the comment was made that over the next several years, the really interesting things are going to come out of states. And this is not just something one says to state legislators. It's true. At the national level, for the next 3 years, we have a Republican House and a Democratic Senate and at least a Democratic president. And it's like two sumo wrestlers of equal size. The House can't make the Senate and the White House do anything, and the Senate and the White House can't make the House do anything. Nobody can push anybody out of that ring. Somebody can make a mistake, but if people are both playing smart, nothing moves in D.C., which is an improvement over the previous 2 years. So everything interesting, not just everything good, but everything interesting is going to come out of the 57 states. And in the states, there are 25 states that have a Republican governor, House, and Senate, and if the Republicans get together, they can turn their state into Texas or Hong Kong as quickly as they want. And there are 13 states with a Democratic governor or Democratic House and Senate, and if they get together and agree, they can turn their states into California or Greece as quickly as they want. And both are moving, and you're seeing real movement on that. And this is important and useful. I run the Taxpayer Protection Pledge, share it with all candidates. I hope everyone here at the state level takes the opportunity to make that commitment to your constituency, to your state, not to raise taxes. Because when you decide you're not going to raise taxes, the second part of that commitment is, and now we're going to reform government. If taxes are on the table, we never reform government because you just raise taxes instead of reforming government. Tax increases are what you do instead of reforming government. But I want to talk today about the judicial system, about prisons, about what Right on Crime, are the co-sponsors of today, Right on Crime and Justice Fellowship have been working on, because this is an increasingly important issue. Prisons and the judicial system are expensive, and they don't do what we think they were going to do when we spent all that money on them, okay? They're not doing the reduction in crime that we need. And I think it's extremely important. Mark Levin, Pat Nolan, many of you are familiar with, have taken leadership roles on this. I started going to a meeting a number of years ago, about 10 of us sitting around, the guys, Ed Meese and others, trying to think through what is the federal government's role? I mean, do they step in and take everything that's already a state crime and make it a federal crime? Yeah, they do it all the time, and they ought not to. Do we really need to have 75-year-olds in prison to keep them from mugging people? I mean, at some point, you're spending $50,000 a year in California to keep a 70-year-old in prison. Really? Why? Are there ways to spend less money and keep the country safer? And so all of these issues, from looking at mandatory minimums and whether they help or hurt in terms of fighting crime, sentencing structures, what should be at the state level, what should be at the national level, conservatives not only can take the leading role in this fight, they have to. And the reason they have to is that the liberals have no credibility on the subject. If a liberal comes up with a good idea on how to fight crime, nobody takes it seriously. And there's a reason for that. They've developed 50 years track record of convincing people they're not serious about these sorts of issues. I grew up in Massachusetts prior to emigrating to the United States. And when I was in college, I went with a bunch of do-gooders. I wasn't, but I went with them to the lifers meeting in Walpole, which all these guys who are in prison for life. And, met with them and talked with people and thought it's a good idea to have prisons. But these are the guys that Mike Dukakis was later, these are people sent in prison for life without parole. Mike Dukakis was later letting out on weekends, and not taking the whole thing seriously, okay? And so a lot of conservatives, starting with me, thought, well, we'll just send people to prison and send them into the judicial system, and they'll get chewed up there, and the people in charge of this will do it right? I mean, this is, we spend more money, we do this, and then I'll go focus on other really important things. And then you check back 20 years later, And it's not doing what we thought we were going to do. We got more people in prison than you need to fight crime. There are other ways now with technology to keep people under wraps and away from everything from ankle bracelets to home arrest to other opportunities. And we need to be, conservatives need to focus on this because we're the only people with any credibility who can take an idea to the people of the state and say, let's take a look at this. Now, there's another part of this, and that is Right on Crime, the group that's put together folks from Gingrich to Jeb Bush to Ed Meese and others, a lot of very interesting folks thinking through how could we handle, and many, many folks at the state level, many in this room, on how do we do better on fighting crime. Texas Public Policy Foundation has put a number of ideas forward, and one of the reasons that it's easier for us to sell and why ALEC taking the Justice Safety Valve Act forward, we can bring an idea to a state legislature, to the people of the state, and point out that this has been done for a couple years in Texas. And I know from testifying in state legislatures, I remember particularly in Florida, I was starting to give a talk, and people were sort of listening, and they said, now, they did this in Texas, and all of a sudden the Republicans all put their papers down and started, oh, so this is a real thing. This isn't some flight of fancy. And I'm very glad that the idea did start in Texas, because if it started in Vermont, it wouldn't translate, okay? Even if it was the same piece of legislation with the same track record, you just wouldn't have any chance of selling it. But because these ideas are coming from right-of-center thinkers, the Justice Safety Valve Act, Senator Chris Schenck was active in working with ALEC to get that drafted and endorsed. These are very important ideas, and we need to take these step by step. I think we need to be clear on a couple things, which I need to be because I generally am against taxes and against spending. That's not why I'm here. That's not why I think these issues are important. We've got to fight crime. We've got to have less crime. We have to be more secure in our persons and in our property. I'm all in favor of chopping the heads off people who commit murder and putting people who are prisoners in prison for a long, long time. There's no bleeding heart whatsoever. This is about punishing real criminals and making sure that we don't just catch everybody in the net, the porpoises and the tunas, and decide to treat them all the same. We need to make sure that we're making distinctions, and the legislation that ALEC has endorsed and recommends to its members at state legislative level, the Justice Safety Valve Act, is just that. It says, when you have these mandatory minimums, and I testified in Congress, at U.S. Congress, because we have a bunch of mandatory minimums in Congress. You read the book of list of mandatory minimums. Treason, 5 years, okay? Things that make headlines, 30 years. And so what they are is somebody had a press conference and decided what they wanted to do was say, I really, really am against this. And so they say mandatory minimum. And they take this as shorthand. I want you to know I care, and so it's 50 years and it's mandatory minimum. And that's not necessarily fighting crime. It is getting a press conference. It is getting somebody attention. I guess my recommendation to them was let these things lapse every few years, like term limits on the legislation, so some new guy could have the press conference, and everybody could get that done. But you really look at it, and I said, these are the headlines of the last 30 years. Every time some congressman saw a headline, he jumped out and held a press conference. Okay. Not every time you have a press conference and message that you care do you need to pass a law that's going to be around for 50 years. And so there are real opportunities at the state level, at the national level. In Washington, D.C., we've got to clean up our act with the federal system. We don't have as many people in prison, but they're getting there. They spend an awful lot of money. They don't need to be spending as much money. They're not effectively fighting crime in the way that the federal government deals with this. And at the state level, take a look. Think about this as an option of something to focus on. There's several opportunities. One is it's man bites dog. When I've done press conferences on some of these issues of reforming criminal justice with Right on Crime, with Justice Fellowship, and you're there with some liberal, all of a sudden, and the liberals will tag along, by the way. I wouldn't let them lead on this fight because they'll hurt they'll confuse people about what you're doing. But it's fine to get their votes at the end of the day in the state legislature. And what's helpful is that they will come along. But you need to make it clear that this is about fighting crime intelligently and smartly, about not wasting money. The last numbers I looked at, California is $50,000 a year to put someone in prison. Florida's $25,000, and they're both too high. But what do you get a difference like that, state to state? What in the world is going on? There are real opportunities here to effectively combat crime, to not trash lives and damage lives that can be salvaged, that can be turned around, and making sure that families can stay together. If you keep people in prison near their families, they're much more likely to behave and turn around than if you send them far enough away that they never see their families again. Families forget them, they forget the families. And this is where the entire broad coalition, from the faith communities that have been involved in this long before taxpayers got involved and focused on what this is doing to people. This is Chuck Colson and others, the prison fellowship folks, people of all faiths who've been working in the prisons trying to figure out how to do it better. The government's not going to turn these people's lives around. And so there's a role for the communities of faith to work on that. Take a look at the Justice Safety Valve Act. I strongly recommend it. There's a national debate that you'll be hearing about. Senator Rand Paul has similar legislation at the national level dealing with the federal mandatory minimums. And again, in the back of this book that's passed out by Families Against Mandatory Minimums, a great group. I look at their website and their resources. But in the back, it has a list of those states that have already taken steps towards reducing or giving some exceptions to mandatory minimums. Again, exceptions not for violent people, not for sexual predators. I mean, you want to be very clear about this is not some sort of blanket, let's all be nice and sing Kumbaya or something. We want to be serious about having bad guys spend the right amount of time in prison and other people spend as much or as little as necessary to whack them on the side of the forehead and get them to try and turn things around and to make the streets safer. But this goes state by state on some of the states that have moved. And what you find looking at it is that when you allowed some judges to have some exceptions and that they're not forced to send people to prison for extremely long periods of time, that they think in this case is not justified, does not increase crime or those crimes in the state. So I think it's particularly important. It's not just about money, it's about what works. There have been some real opportunities. Take a look at the websites Right on Crime, Justice Fellowship, Texas Public Policy Foundation, Families Against Mandatory Minimums. This is a real opportunity for conservatives like me who didn't pay attention because they just figured somebody was handling this, okay? And all we had to do was say, fine, lock them up, end of conversation, and somehow this is going to work. This is the one government program that's not going to need people to keep an eye on it, and it won't serve its own interests, and it won't make the prison guards happy. It'll actually work for what's important for the people of each state. That was kind of foolish on my part to assume that one part of the government operated unlike all the other parts of the government. And this is about saving. It does save money, but it saves lives and communities and makes it safer for all of us. I think we have a real opportunity as conservatives to show our heart as well as our hard-headed common sense. And again, I think you'll find in your state, if as you see these issues introduced, dealing with mandatory minimums and other criminal justice issues, it's a wonderful opportunity to talk to press people in a capacity that they're not used to hearing from the conservative about. But not in any way. This is not moving to the center. This is not being reasonable. This is not being moderate or any of this nonsense, okay? This is about doing what we think needs to get done to fight crime sensibly and in a way that's not overly expensive to taxpayers and that actually works. So with that said, thank you very much. ALEC, thank you for your leadership. The progress we're making is all going to come from the states. When you do something right in a state, ALEC is the transmission belt that takes it from one state to the other states to say, hey, look at what worked. That's why I'm so optimistic about Right on Crime and the efforts to reform mandatory minimums, because we've got several states where it's been done in a number of ways, where some of the approaches conservatives have put forward to reduce the number of people in prison and the amount of time they're in prison while continuing to see crime decline. They are not having a bunch of crime in Texas as a result of their reforms. They're having less crime in a more dramatic reductions than other states that have done it the old way. So this is the opportunity to take a good idea that's been tested. And the best thing about it, when you're talking to, not you of course, but when you talk to fellow legislators, you can assure them that nothing bad happens when this legislation passes, meaning nobody loses an election. It's helpful, it makes the citizens safer, but it's also something that we've tried in other states. This is not some idea they thought up at Harvard. This is an idea that's actually been working in serious states and with conservative think tanks working at it, and they can always provide examples and data and the stuff that I've been talking about in generalities, so you can show how crime continues to reduce while some of these projects have moved forward. That said, thank you for getting elected. Please get re-elected. Please crush the other team, and looking forward to working with all of you. Thank you.